So Colombia, it's in South America, and we're joined by Tamas Tayani, who's actually come back around about 6 weeks ago, was it, Tamas?
Nearly 2 months now.
What took you out there in the first place?
I was trying to live on the land here, and we came up against a very big hurdle insofar as you don't own land here. The Queen leases it to you, or the Crown leases it to you.
And well, hang on a minute, because a lot of people who've bought their freeholds, who think they own their land, that might be news to them. They might actually be a little bit worried about the fact that a freehold doesn't actually entirely entitle you to the land.
Well, for sure, if they were to go and try to do anything on that land that is outside of its rubber stamp documents, try and make it, if it's agricultural, they want to do something commercial or industrial or residential, then they're going to come against problems, and they'll soon find that that land is not actually theirs. It's all leased to them by the Crown.
Okay, so you decided to go to another country where it was actually you were able to do what you wanted to do. Is that why you were over there?
More or less, yes. Or at least to have the freedom to live how I thought humanity should live, which is free on the land.
Right. So how did you find whereabouts you and where did you end up staying?
Well, we were putting on an event in the place we're living here in England, or in Wales, actually, better said. And in that moment, during that whole process, we met some Colombians. And there's just something there in the Latin American spirit, the Latin American people. They just have something almost like raw, organic humanity left in them. And I sort of felt something there and something special in them. And there they started speaking to me about a lot of the control grid in this country, which at first I didn't really understand or I sort of agreed. But actually going to Colombia, I can see how deep that control is and how far that stretches back in the history.
Well, give us a bit of insight. That's fascinating. If you've got foreigners actually teaching you something about Britain, saying there's a control grid here, what do you mean by that?
It works on a lot of levels. I mean, for instance, one of the Colombians that came, he looked at the churches all around the country, and I knew that the churches were all grown on the sort of sacred sites where you used to have yew trees, and they cut the yew trees down. They used the yew trees to then melt the rock to make cannons. And so all the sacred sites, all the yew trees there, helped imperialism by making cannons and blowing up all the people they needed to blow up that were in the way. And then they built the churches, and then around the churches they buried their dead in the graveyards. And so when you look at that, of all the sacred sites in this country, how they're now just totally surrounded by the cemeteries and graveyards, and those are all the original sacred sites of this country. And that's just one aspect of that control grid.
Well, I mean, some people will say, look at the pre-Christian, the sort of barrows right across Wiltshire, for example. I mean, it's a similar kind of thing. People wanted somewhere sacred to leave their loved ones when they passed on.
That's true, and usually they'd use, in the past, there would be the elm tree that would have been sacred and would have been the tree that you'd have buried your dead near, and it wouldn't have been near yew trees. And now we know with the elm tree there's a disease with them, and they're going out of fashion. They're all dying.
Well, yeah, so the control grid, though, surely more is really around money. I mean, obviously in Colombia it's a little bit easier to get your hands on land than it is here in Britain. And actually it's land that which people thrive on. They can build their homes on, they can build a workshop on the land, they can actually grow food in the land. And are there still places in Colombia where people can just grow without having to pay rent to anyone?
I mean, I think so. There's no, as far as we're aware, there's no rent or there's no kind of, taxes like you get here of the enormous taxes that you get just for being on the land here. And pretty much there is still free reign, depending where you are. And obviously in the jungle, that's still, hasn't been sold yet. Because
that's another thing here. If you started trying to just grow some vegetables and put up a shack on a bit of land in Britain, you're not going to last long. Anyway, old Labour Oxford economist Martin Summers, can you just give us a little bit of the context? Because right now there's negotiations going on, aren't there, between South American Colombian factions. They're not actually taking place within Colombia. They're taking place in Cuba and supervised by the Norwegians. The idea is that this is all going to be very fair and that the civil war, effectively, that's been going on in Colombia for decades may stand some chance of being negotiated here. What are your thoughts about that?
Well, I'll just share what my interest in Colombia is. I'm a member of Colombia's Solidarity Campaign, and I actually visited Colombia fairly briefly in 2005 on a delegation for the representing British trade unions. The civil war in Colombia, which has been raging since the 1940s, is very much about land and access to land. And one of the sticking points in the negotiations between the Revolutionary Armed Forces of Colombia, FARC, and the regime in Bogotá is this whole idea of land reform, access to land, allowing people basically to look after themselves by subsistence agriculture. It's not, you've got a very high concentration of land ownership in Colombia, like in other Latin American countries, where most of the best land is in the hands of big landowners who want to grow coffee, or palm oil has become a very big crop in recent years, sugar, all of which can be very destructive for the traditional way of life of indigenous communities and other poorer Colombians. For example, freed slaves in the 1880s all went to live on the land, and this struggle has been going on. So one of the sticking points in the negotiations is the government in Bogotá prepared to give people access to land? And the Norwegians who've been helping to facilitate the discussions have been, trying to encourage the government of Santos, who's the current president, to not just say let's have peace, put down the guns, let's stop killing each other. And of course, a lot of people have been killed in Colombia. It's been very, very brutal civil war that's been going on. And land, access to land is one of the key demands of the people in general and of the guerrillas in particular.
Yeah, that's it's actually really important, isn't it? Something we've kind of lost sight of here in Britain is that we really need to have our own bit of land, even just to get started. I mean, for many people, that is a mortgage, and of course that takes decades to pay off. But anyway, Temash, can you just give us an idea of, if the people you stayed with, had they managed to find somewhere reasonably permanent to stay, where they could do subsistence farming and then maybe have a little bit of a surplus to trade with the outside world and at least live?
Well, these people, they started in the jungle as an indigenous community, and this is like anything between 20, 30 years ago they started getting established, and about 20 years ago, 13 years ago, the civil war came to them, just as it extends further and further into nature, and they had to flee. They have now come under the banner of displaced indigenous, which is now in the hundreds of thousands of people out there, and so they've relocated to a place that is, commercially, you call it agricultural commercial land. You don't have any rainforest trees there, because if you cut one tree down, you can't leave one tree left, so you cut down the whole area, and then that becomes, the commercially viable area.
And one of the things that was really worried me about what's happening over there, I know you were saying to me just before we started that some of the people, you buy fair trade coffee here. That's one of the things. The two things Colombia is known for is its coffee and its cocaine. But with the coffee, at least you hope that if you're buying fair trade coffee, that's actually helping the right people in Colombia. Well,
it does what it says in the tin. That extra money goes to the farmers in Colombia. But who are those farmers? Who are they connected to? For instance, at the moment, in this time, there's been a national strike in Colombia, specifically from the coffee growers, because there's so much coffee being grown now that it's just flooding the market, and there's no way of them making a living through coffee anymore. And during this whole process of the national strike and all the coffee growers united to fight against the corruption, we've found that there are coffee growers who are connected to these groups, to fair trade groups, specifically to Rainforest Alliance, that they still crop their coffee and they still sell it for a good price. And they themselves are the richer landowners, and the ones that, when the smaller farmers, that they can't sell their coffee, they can't actually grow anything, they end up working for these bigger companies. And we've known people who've basically tried to take them to court because of violence, because of threats, and they found that their corruption, and they have a protection at a governmental local council level that's connected to all these fair trade supposedly institutes.
But I mean, surely that's to do with the fact that they're trying to strike. I mean, obviously, if they can't get unity amongst all the coffee growers, then there's not much point in striking.
Well, that is an interesting subject there, because what the governments are trying to do and the way they're trying to overcome this strike is that they're then trying to section off certain individuals and certain people who are, say, dedicated to one crop, be it coffee, potatoes, sugar, bananas, plantains. And the coffee, the farmers who are dedicated to those crops, they're small in number, they're in the bigger farms, and the government really only want to get in contact, only want to be in negotiation with these farmers. And the actual smaller subsistence farmers, they're the ones who really they cannot buy the membership to FairTrade, they cannot ever produce the coffee necessary to actually to join that cabal of people.
Martin, this sounds a little bit dodgy, doesn't it? I mean, the idea that you're buying coffee which is actually helping people who are undermining the subsistence farmers, the poorest in Colombia. What about those who are actually working on these farms? Are they properly employed? In other words, are they given any kind of permanent jobs, or are they just day labourers like we have over here now, these 0-hour contracts where you actually may not get paid at all?
A lot of the labourers over there, they get paid in the coffee that they pick, that they then carry to the places to sell them, because the farmer themselves knows that they cannot afford to pay that worker and then sell their coffee, so they pick the coffee, they sell it, and these are the smaller farmers that people in this country would think that the fair trade organisations would be going to. But when you get a country like Colombia, where corruption is so woven into the system, the idea that some do-gooding fair trade company is going there and is doing a Robin Hood mission and really putting that money into the poor farmers is a joke.
Well, yes, it's fascinating to get a bit of insight as to what really goes on the ground. Martin, on the other side, the cocaine. Tell us a bit about the cocaine trade, because we've been hearing for decades now about this war on drugs. It doesn't seem to have really been getting anywhere. How does this international trade in cocaine operate?
Well, the Plan Colombia was brought in during the Clinton era, and it was a basically massive US financial and military support to so-called suppress the coca trade. But in actual fact, Colombian cocaine in the 1980s was being transported to the United States by the CIA and the Contras in Nicaragua in order to fund the Nicaraguan Contras in their struggle to overthrow the Sandinista regime in Nicaragua. So the United States government is fantastically hypocritical in its so-called war on drugs in Latin America. It's basically an excuse to intervene in countries where they've got other interests. So the war on drugs is essentially a cover for their other activities. And of course Uribe, who was the former president of Colombia, was named by the DEA in the US as a major drug dealer. And he basically, although he was a US ally, was a major drug dealer. And Convivencia, which was the right-wing paramilitaries, which then became Auto Unidas Defensas de Colombia, and they've now become the Black Eagles and various other organisations. These right-wing paramilitary organisations were dealing cocaine with the full knowledge and understanding of the United States government, and basically given a nod and a wink. So what goes on, and people in Latin America are very well aware of this, if you are the right kind of drug dealer, the US government winks and nods and lets you get away with what you're doing. If you're the wrong kind of drug dealer, then they'll throw everything at you to get rid of the competition. And people are very cynical about it. And I think across the political spectrum in Latin America now, from Mexico down to the southern cone, there's a real push on now to legalise all drugs, because people are dying every day to enforce this so-called prohibition, which has become a farce and a joke.
Well, there's obviously a massive trade in these cocaine and in other illegal drugs going on. Where does the money go to that's made out of this drugs trade? And you're saying that some of the intelligence agencies, the governments, are actually turning a blind eye to it, the military.
Well, there's a UN report on drugs and crime that came out in 2009, basically drawn up by police officers working with the UN, and it was absolutely clear where the money went. It went to bail the banks out. Without the cocaine money and the heroin money, the banks would have collapsed in 2008, 2009. At that stage, all of the so-called illegal, dirty money went sloshing through the system like a tsunami. And the HSBC were convicted, if you remember, not long ago, of money laundering in Mexico, and they got a minuscule fine in terms of the money they'd made, and they just went back to business as usual. That's the real world, folks. We're busting teenagers for smoking a joint. Meanwhile, the banking system is being propped up by the drug cartels. And
what about you mentioned Iran-Contra? I mean, there's gun running too going on as part of this?
Mina Air Base in Arkansas was being used by the CIA and the Nicaraguan Contras. They were flying in light planes full of cocaine, and then they were flying out planes full of weaponry for the war in Nicaragua. And incidentally, there was a crash of a light plane in northern Mexico a couple of years ago, full of cocaine, fairly standard stuff. The police impounded it. The last time that plane was seen was on the tarmac at Glasgow Airport, being used by the CIA for extraordinary rendition. So what have we got here? Let's just be absolutely clear. The Western intelligence services have been involved in drug dealing for a very long time. The whole war in Afghanistan in the 1980s was funded with heroin. There's no doubt about it. The evidence is in. And at the same time, this war on drugs is pushed down everybody's throats as a means of intervening in these countries, keeping all. I mean, the Colombian military basically have been used to try and suppress the armed uprising under the cover of a war on drugs. So they call the FARC narco guerrillas and so on. FARC basically does make money from drugs, but then so does everybody else. I mean, they would just say, well, that's the only money that goes. You know, we protect the farmers and we tax them, and that's how we fund our activities.
How has this all translated it out on the ground, Timash? I mean, what evidence have you seen of this trade in your time in Colombia?
Obviously, when I say I'm in Colombia or I mention Colombia, it's like a word association game, and everyone goes, Colombia, cocaine, violence. And it's interesting there because in Colombia, 50% of the population are rural, what they would call peasant farmers or campesinos. And really being there on the ground, you do not see, like the regular peasant farmers carrying cocaine, growing cocaine or anything like this. Obviously in the bigger cities you do have these problems. And even then I haven't actually seen any of the white powder. And everything that I've seen in terms of social degeneration has come from one of the raw ingredients to the cocaine, which I think they call their bazooka. And that is basically something that's destroying the youth there, and that's one of the raw ingredients, like the black sludge, before you then purify it, apparently, to get the real good stuff, apparently.
Martin, you're nodding there.
Yeah, well, bazooka it's what's left when you've made the stuff that you sell to the high end. Yuppie type stuff.
That is.
And what you got left is bazooka, which is the poor people.
So this is basically a byproduct from refining cocaine into the Western market, and this is sold out in cocaine.
Yeah, but I think
Tomasz
would also agree that traditionally in Latin America, coca rather than cocaine has been very much part of traditional culture and has been for thousands of years. So I was watching a program, Lost Kingdoms of Latin America, on BBC 4 last night, and it was quite clear that the Kogi, who are a Colombian tribe, they're using coca every day as they have done for thousands of years.
There are tribes in Colombia that survived all the repression and all the invasion of the Spanish, and they practically have survived through coca, and they themselves see it as a very sacred plant and just a gift from Pachamama, as they say over there. And they also had a prophecy that the white man would come and turn it into something of a means of destruction, just like the yew tree here was sacred, and that became the tool which they used as imperialism, and it's the same over there with their sacred plants as well.
Timash, tell us a little bit more about the strikes that are going on at the moment. What's the motivation for it? You mentioned these briefly, but obviously when someone is taking away their labour and actually having then trouble surviving, it takes quite a lot to do that. So what's the motivation behind it? What is they hoping to achieve?
Well, really they're just hoping to get the freedom to live as they have always lived and their ancestors have lived. And obviously at the moment it's the case that the bigger fish is coming up and eating the smaller fish. At the moment a very big fish has moved in terms of genetically modified crops from North America that has basically flooded the market over there, much cheaper than all the grains and all their native seeds over there. There is a new law that's come out that Santos has pushed, and that it makes their own native seeds illegal, and they can only use genetically modified Monsanto seeds. The sister company to Monsanto over there is called Bienestar, which means well-being, just as Monsanto means my saint.
Okay, so how does this work, though? I mean, the supermarkets are... I mean, I would have thought that subsistence farmers wouldn't even be using supermarkets.
I think mainly most of the peasant farmers themselves, they appreciate and they have a solidarity amongst them of the situation. But because of the fast development of the country and all the media and the way, I say, modernisation is basically touching every corner of that country, where roads and the TVs go in, to a lot of people, they just see the media. And obviously, we've had, if you like this country, it's here in Great Britain, has been like the guinea pig of the sort of destruction of the community spirit, putting everyone into boxes, giving everyone a box to watch, and it's destroying something so people do not have the information. And obviously they demonise or they ridicule the people who are obviously more peasants or the more sort of archetypal people, as if they are the ones who are dragging the country into the mud and stopping them from progressing.
Well, one of the things we've definitely lost over here is a sort of community memory of how to organise amongst, within communities. So, yes, the use of the word guerrilla, I mean, this is maybe not really fair to describe FARC as the guerrillas and also the ordinary indigenous people, because the fact that they're fighting back is actually quite a positive thing when what they're fighting effectively is a sort of fascist state. Martin, what's going on along those lines about, sort of communities actually trying to assert themselves?
I think ordinary people don't want to be regarded as armed opponents of the state just because they disagree with state policy. And, of course, it's always been the goal of the state to make everybody who opposes things like, development projects and so on to be guerrillas or guerrilla sympathisers. And in actual fact, the accusation of being a guerrilla sympathiser has allowed the militarisation of rural areas of Colombia, and then people are driven off their traditional lands, and it turns out that those traditional lands have got oil, gold, diamonds, or other natural resources underneath them. So in actual fact, the war has been used by big companies as a means of driving away people who are basically, traditional farmers, and to get their land off them without having to pay compensation or even to negotiate with them in any way. And a lot of rural people in Colombia see this as a scam, basically, to get rid of their traditional way of life.
Timash, how aware do you think are most Native Americans and the people you were staying with of these various systems to, what's going on in other parts of the world, which is bringing about oppression for them effectively? I mean, particularly with the drugs trade, the big international coffee markets, that kind of thing.
In terms of the genetical modification and the crops that come from the United States and their seeds, a lot of people and a lot of the media have plugged it up to be something absolutely very good. And you go to the markets there where you'd have like one stall, which might be more commercially focused, and they have these great big tomatoes, and you can pick up tomato and say, do you know there's a gene spliced in this tomato of a fish? And they would stick their thumbs up and smile and say, yeah, it sounds great. And you go to the smaller marketplaces where they got their own traditional tomatoes, and when you speak to them, they cannot afford to buy these other seeds. So it's not out of awareness that they're sticking with their old seeds, actually out of poverty. They don't have the time to go and research, and they just collect their own seeds. They've just been doing what they've been doing for the last, for intergenerational. And obviously there's a severe lack of education on that front for them.
Yeah, well, I mean, surely, if people are buying seeds from these seed companies like Monsanto for these sort of giant tomatoes, does that mean that the seeds will only just last for one crop and then the seeds become useless? So these subsistence farmers and other people in agriculture have to keep going back and buying more?
I haven't seen, in terms of the big, like tomatoes, for instance, we have seen people and known people who basically planted the seed after seed, but now they introduced a new law there which makes all that illegal for them to retain their native seeds. And in terms of suicide seed, I haven't actually seen that myself, but then again, the main people who use all the suicide seeds or the main big Monsanto crops, like I say, it's not the individual small farmer, it's the bigger farming cartels, and really you wouldn't imagine to get much truth from them anyway if you were to ask them just a fairly simple question.
OK, we're going to hear a bit more about the future in Colombia, some positive things and some more threats that there might be to the country. I mean, this is another subject when you're talking about South America. A lot of people actually over there, as well as some here, talk about assassinations. Martin, we've been hearing recently about the chap we were just hearing that from, Bob Marley. What do you know about that?
Well, I mean, there was certainly an attempt to assassinate him by Jamaica Labour Party gangsters in the 1970s because of his perceived People's National Party loyalties, although Marley himself didn't claim to have any such loyalties. I mean, political violence is there, and it's certainly there in Colombia.
But there are allegations that he was actually killed by the Americans, weren't there?
Well, there are, and indeed plenty of people in America, in Colombia, are killed by the government, which is the Americans, and maybe, but also the British as well.
I mean, didn't he get cancer, Bob Marley? And there were some allegations that it was in his, was some sort of spike in his.
Well, we don't know, but I mean, the fact is that there was definitely an attempt to kill him with a gun, which was carried out for political reasons. But that's fairly common stuff in Colombia. During the 1980s, the FARC actually called a ceasefire, stood 3,000 candidates in local elections across Colombia. Every one of those candidates was assassinated, all 3,000. And at that point, they called off the ceasefire and went back to the mountains. I mean, that's the situation in the past in Colombia. And when I was over there on the delegation in 2005, people I was speaking to were assassinated subsequently. And they also killed a homeless person around the corner from us in Bogota with a small bomb. And And
what was the point of that?
Well, the local trade union leader said to us, well, they wouldn't try and kill you because you're foreigners and that would create a problem, but by killing him, they're sending a message. And it's a violent place for those who stand up for justice, and it always has been. But people are incredibly brave, and I went to meet brave people, and I wasn't disappointed. We
also, there's quite a lot of evidence that Hugo Chavez may have been poisoned as well. Any thoughts on that, either of you?
It's something that he himself has said, that his cancer was something that was given to him by the United States or by the CIA. And it's been known for the last decade or so that the CIA has drugs and means of giving people certain cancers in order to knock them off. And really in Venezuela, that's something that is not superstition, but something that is very believable.
Martin, is there any evidence of that?
Well, the CIA themselves have boasted of their 40-plus attempts to kill Fidel Castro, and they're quite proud of it. So when you say that would they kill somebody like Chavez, the answer is yes, they would.
And are there South American leaders also who've died of cancer?
Yes,
I think
that's what Chavez
Hugo was talking about that, wasn't he? Yeah, so this is the climate that's over there. Thousands of people standing for elections being killed. Leaders of countries who are a little bit radical and maybe a bit socialist and anti-United States getting killed. So this is pretty frightening. It's good to hear, though, that Timash, that there are some senators who are brave enough to speak out against the regime. This one, Piedad Cordoba, I probably haven't pronounced her name correctly.
Piedad Cordoba. She was a senator that was involved in the government, and obviously when you're involved at that level, she obviously saw the corruption, and she got disillusioned, so she left politics, and then after building up a bit of force, came back. And people have likened her to like the female Chavez of Latin America. Friends there who say, and also this has apparently been confirmed as well, that Venezuela recently bought fighter jets from the United States, and that the actual peace talks between the guerrillas in Colombia and the Colombian government is a step, because now they have that infrastructure in place to then do the war against Venezuela that the US have been wanting to do now for a very long time.
So that's one side effect, possibly, of the ending of the civil war, is that Colombia, Martin, might focus its guns on the next-door neighbour in Venezuela.
Yes, it's true, but I think, on the other hand, Chavez, when he was alive, was very much involved in bringing together the Colombian government and the FARC. And I think that there is real hope about this peace process, despite the disappointments of the past. Santos isn't quite the same as Uribe. Uribe was, basically a criminal and should be basically taken to the European, to the International Criminal Court. Santos is a more, Santos has committed his regime to making these peace talks work, and he's got people on his side who are not happy with him talking, and I think there's more realism about the talks this time, in the sense that, for example, there's been no ceasefire. The fighting has continued because nobody trusts both sides don't trust each other. But the talks do seem to be progressing, and some hope is that this terrible civil war that's been raging for decades can be brought to an end.
But in terms of what Piedad Cordoba is bringing to light over there and trying to communicate to the people, is that the current President Santos, he was the defence minister for Uribe. And so the actual, just logistically looking at that and knowing that the defence minister had all the crimes of Uribe, he was almost like the next in line, or was very much in that link. And so the idea that Santos is like the better face of Colombia, when you put that in that context of him being the defence minister of one of the most brutal drug trafficking dictators out there, voted in, possibly, then you have to question the whole public image of this Santos and why... For instance, there, Cordoba says a very good thing of that in the media there's always some debate between Santos and Uribe, and Uribe is criticising Santos, saying he shouldn't be doing like this, he should change all the, specifically with the talks with the FARC. But it's, created division, where they're on the same side, they're covering each other's crimes, but they're just pretending to be the opposition to each other. So,
not Martin, it sounds to what Timash is saying there that you may have brought a bit of spin about this new president. I mean, this is a little bit worrying, isn't it, when the guy who was responsible for some of the worst crimes under the previous president is now made president. He may look a bit better, his image might be different on the TV, he may have a nicer, shinier suit, but is he actually going to be any better?
Well, I think that's for those who are negotiating with him to decide. if FARC decides that they want to carry on the fight, then I think it is actually incumbent on the rest of the world to respect that decision. But if they decide that for the sake of the ordinary people, if they're prepared to talk and try and find a negotiated compromise, that is for them to do.
It doesn't say a lot about democracy, does it? If you've got someone who's democratically elected, who's not only an international drug dealer, but also a violent totalitarian.
Well, when you say democratically elected, you've got to remember there are only a minority of people end up going to the polls.
But it is a democracy.
No, well, it is a kind of a democracy, but as I said, when FARC tried to stand their candidates in the election, they were all murdered. And that's quite frequently happens. Trade union leaders are frequently murdered, campesino leaders are frequently murdered. What kind of democracy is that when anybody who stands for election who is in any way radical gets murdered? That's not a democracy, is it?
And there also were townships out there that basically were led to the election polls by the paramilitaries to vote for Uribe.
Yeah.
Okay, so it doesn't sound like much of a real democracy at all. Martin, I mean, this it's all very well... because the thing is, many of us in this part of the world don't actually know much about the details. We would figure, if it's a democracy, then it's got to be better than a dictatorship. But, I mean, you may have countries which are, with a benevolent dictator, would actually function a hell of a lot better than Colombia.
Well, you could argue that people in Cuba, by and large, are better off than the poorest sections of society in Colombia, and that's possibly true. I think, ultimately... democracy is winning in the rest of Latin America. You've still got tremendous social injustice, even in countries like like Venezuela, which have made big progress in the last decades. You've still got a small minority of extremely wealthy people and a large number of people who get very, very, very little out of the system. But I don't think we should throw away the baby with the bathwater. Genuine democracy, which gives people real hope of social justice, is surely the way forward if we can make it work.
In Venezuela, could it happen in Colombia?
Well, that is obviously the...
Really?
Yes, I think it could. The problem is that the people like Chavez have been killed off in Venezuela, in Colombia. You see, that's the problem. In the dirty war in Argentina, 30,000 people were killed by the regime. Those 30,000 people are the people that should be running Argentina now, but of course they're all dead, and that what you're left with. This was made very clear to me in Colombia. They're saying what we have to do, our leaders expect to be murdered, and therefore they have to train up other people to take over their roles. But of course the people coming forward to take over those roles are not nearly as gifted as the people who get murdered, and they've got to start from scratch each time.
A little bit like the Breivik murders in Norway, where the potential future leaders of the country for the Labour Party were murdered by Breivik.
Precisely.
Tim Ash, what are your thoughts about the future? Because is there a possibility for a sort of Chavez figure in Colombia, or is it simply going to be a whole queue and everyone will have a choice between 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 different totalitarian drug-dealing dictators?
There is definitely hope there amongst the people, and they say the battle is never lost until one loses hope, and if it's something that the Latin American people have, it's a tremendous amount of hope. When the Allende government in Chile was overthrown by Pinochet, after that process there of that country gradually going up towards socialism, and not talking the communist style of socialism where the government owns the state and the people, but where socialism where the people are the will of the people, are the government and own the land. And when Pinochet came in, it was a massive attack against the socialism, and in one generation you had a whole nation basically on its knees and then ready to accept all the dictates of the world free trade agreements and all this. In Colombia, that war's been going on for so long that they say the tactic of just bringing in a dictator that would do something real bloody, I mean, they've already had that under the pretext of democracy. And so the general saying there is that they cannot just use the old tactic of bringing a dictator and overthrow the regime. And so they're in an interesting position now where everything stands on knife point. And specifically, when you look at things like a lot of the cocaine for the super rich is now moving out of Colombia, and it makes you wonder, are they still expecting Colombia to be their lapdog, or is there going to be something inside? A lot of people there speak of insurrection, of revolution, which is something, it's almost an unforgotten word here. But they're the people on the ground, even though they're not educated, they feel that and they hope for that, and there's a lot of hope there.
Well, that's good news. Also, you've mentioned to me before we started the show that the Chinese are taking quite an interest, and specifically, potentially anyway, looking for gathering the water, because Colombia has some of the best water supplies for South America. Obviously, it's on the equator, very hot, and some parts of that part of the world, water is really the most important commodity around.
In all of Latin America, Colombia has the most water per area. than any other part of Latin America. And you have the phenomenon that it's on the equator, you've got the Andes, so you have a lot of rain that's put through the mountain system that goes through these huge rivers. And in those river basins, which have their own ecosystems that are specific to Colombia itself, they're now being bought out, sold out to the Chinese. Actually, they were sold a long, long time ago, and now the guerrilla warfare is all kind of dying down and there's this peace. Now big businesses have gone in there and have started building these dams. Not only with China as well, there's a company from Spain, and there's in all there's a plan for 33 dams being built. In one of these dams, the Chinese uncovered gold, because in this area they say there's a lot of buried gold in that area, and that this gold has curses, or this gold has a certain magic of it. And for some reason, as if by magic, the Chinese just seem to know where that gold is, and they've managed to buy the land where that gold is, and they've uncovered it. And because that's their land, they've bought it, they've just taken it back to their bank vaults.
Amazing. Okay, Martin, what are your thoughts about the sort of general politics of water? Because it's becoming more important. Quite clearly in the Middle East it's very important. Is this part of a sort of a wider resource war where big companies, powerful countries, empires are trying to grab water supplies around us?
Yes, and I think Colombia has probably got the widest cross-section of raw materials, not just water. They've got everything else. They've got gold, oil, diamonds. They've got lots of good agricultural land. They've only got a population of 37 million people. And if it was a properly managed place, there is no reason why it shouldn't be a prosperous place for everybody. Yeah. But of course, the problem with having all of these resources is that people want to steal them, whoever they are, whether it's big companies or maybe the Chinese. Although what the Venezuelans have been doing is doing deals with the Chinese as a way of getting out from under the pressure of the Americans. And it's a shame that people who live in such a potentially wealthy country live in such miserable poverty and such horrible conditions.
Chemash, do you think it's better for them to be doing deals with the Chinese and the Americans?
It really depends how much you've read and which side of the coin. There are some people that say it's all a part of the same control mechanism. When someone is that focused on money and profits and resources, really they're in the same playground. Be it under what banner or what flag.
Yeah, okay. Finally, many of us hear about Colombia as a very dangerous country. I mean, what would you say to people who are thinking about visiting it?
There are dangers out there, and there are a lot of red zones. If you go into the south and the places that are not very well built up in the jungle, then you do have a lot of factions that will cause problems, and there are still kidnappings that happen in those areas. And obviously they're red zones. But it's a bit of a delicate situation because you also have red zones that are not red zones because they're dangerous to the tourists. They're dangerous because if the tourists saw what was happening in those red zones, that would, and then they brought that to the international community, that would look very embarrassing for the Colombian society, and they're very image conscious of their own country. I certainly recommend to people that there is the stereotypical threat that you see of Colombia really is not as powerful as it is, and actually you can go through a lot of the country and just meet a whole bunch of very good human beings.
For anyone thinking about visiting Colombia, obviously you can go over there on a little package tour, you can stay somewhere for a few weeks, but I mean, what would you say to anyone thinking about maybe wanting to get a bit of real life and go off the beaten track?
Well, for myself, I had the luck and the privilege to go off the beaten track because I met Colombians in this country, and they're the ones who I went to stay with. And in that sense, being there, I managed to then get very well acquainted with the culture and with the campesino life. So it's definitely worth having contacts and knowing people. But then you find in Latin America, it's not like the London Underground. You can actually meet and speak to a lot of people, and people will take you in, and people will really help you and clothe you. As I say, there's no social system out there, which means that people work hard and that people look after each other. And if anyone's going out there to actually work or to do something to help the people, with a good heart, they will find the people they need. In that sense, you could go stay on the beaten track, and gradually you could meet the people where they would be able to take you to more remote places. Some of them are red zones, but it's important to know that not all the red zones are red because it's a danger to the tourists, but because of the regime.
Sounds like it's good that there's still some places on this planet you can go and have an adventure.
Yes.
All right. Okay, Tomasz and Old Labour Oxford economist Martin Summers, thanks very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
BCFM is the community radio station for Bristol and is here to give everybody in Bristol a voice.